It's like something from a Hollywood horror movie. A hospital where patients are given massive doses of drugs like LSD, intensive shock therapy, put to sleep for months at a time.
I was reduced to a baby and wearing diapers and being fed and, I can't imagine it. I don't remember that, thank goodness, because it would haunt me in my dreams.
But at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, the nightmare was all too real. And incredibly, what happened there was secretly supported by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and the Canadian government.
It just doesn't make sense that you can take a mother away from her children and ruin her life and that other people won't be affected too.
I'm Bob McEwen. On this Fifth Estate, we investigate what the Government of Canada kept hidden for decades and what they're still trying to hide. It was 1964, and 5-year-old Diane McIntosh couldn't wait when her father said they were going for a drive to visit her mother, who was in the hospital.
My dad used to let me sit on his knee and steer the car, and so that was play.
On each visit, their car would turn onto the long drive leading through the hospital grounds to the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal, a psychiatric facility with the best reputation in the country. More than half a century later, Diane still remembers what she saw then, as if it were yesterday. Because when they got to the hospital door, her enthusiasm turned to horror.
When we got there, the place was just like a scene from One Flew Out of the Cuckoo's Nest. There were people banging their heads on the walls and droning, and my mother was sitting there completely drugged up. And even as a child, I knew that she wasn't right.
What they didn't know at the time was that her mother, Ellen McIntosh, and hundreds of others like her were unwitting guinea pigs in brutal psychiatric experiments that took place at the Allen Institute under the code name MK Ultra. Massive drug regimens, enforced prolonged sleep, intensive electroshock, largely funded by the Canadian government and the American CIA. No consent was ever asked from the patients, and no explanation of the experiments was ever given to them. The MK Ultra brainwashing project got its start in the early days of the Cold War, when some Canadian and American soldiers returning from the conflict in Korea expressed sympathy for their communist enemies. At a time of paranoia about the so-called Red Menace, the Americans believed the Soviets and Chinese might well have devised an effective brainwashing method, and the CIA was determined to crack it, as ex-CIA officer John Gittinger told the Fifth Estate in 1980.
So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of other people.
But the CIA knew it could be politically difficult to fund brainwashing directly, so it set up a front company to do it, euphemistically called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology.
These are the days and hours are the occasion.
And they found a prominent scholar doing related research in Montreal, the renowned psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, co-founder of the World Psychiatric Association. Those who worked with Cameron called him domineering, and more.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
And it is his mind, no less, which may destroy mankind.
Over the years, in addition to CIA funding, Dr. Cameron received Canadian government research grants worth well over $4 million today for experiments on what was called psychic driving and depatterning, attempts to erase negative memories from the human mind and replace them with new, positive ones. So it was that in 1962, a 23-year-old mother of two, Hélène McIntosh, was referred to Ewan Cameron for what she thought would be a time out from the pressures of motherhood and marriage.
They promised me that I would get rested. I was told that I would be looked after in the hospital.
Depressed after the birth of her second child, her GP recommended Dr. Cameron. No one told her she would be part of a radical science project with a full menu of experimental treatments, shock, drugs like LSD, months of induced sleep with recordings bombarding her subconscious 24/7. After all that, Hélène McIntosh says she effectively became an infant again.
That was hell. It really was. It's something that you can't describe. And when I start talking about it, I start shaking. My body shakes. It's like my body's saying, don't go there.
Today, Hélène has only a few scattered memories of her years at the Allen.
Electroshock and a picture of Dr. Cameron, but I do remember him. I remember his voice very clearly.
What do you remember about it?
He sat me in front of a group of medical students or doctors that were doing their residency, and he said, "This woman is hopelessly incurable," and that was it. And he was so cold.
But through all of that, her young daughter Diane, raised by grandparents, lived for those special times when her mother got the chance to spend a few hours with her girls.
I remember when she was able to come out for a visit, and she would be able to come over and tuck me in at my granny's place, and I would just lie there immobile after she left. And when Granny would come in to say goodnight, I'd say, "Don't touch the covers, don't touch the covers, don't change it," because Mom left it this way. And I try to sleep all night without moving the covers.
In all, Hélène McIntosh spent 2 years at the Allen Institute, most of her memories erased like data on a hard drive.
That's you.
Yeah.
Look how dark my hair is. I don't think that's...
Today, at home in British Columbia, much of the McIntosh family album is a mystery to Hélène. Now it's Diane who must guide her mom through the images of the past she no longer remembers.
There's Carolyn. So they're not in order.
No, that's me.
That's you, of course.
It is clear that in different ways, both McIntoshes are victims of that secret brainwashing project in Montreal, and they are far from alone. Hundreds of victims passed through these doors in the 1950s and 60s, all with their own horror stories.
I feel like I've been completely used. I feel like my mind has been completely invaded.
Had to be toiletry. I was a vegetable. I had no identity, I had no memory, I'd never existed in the world before.
I had lost all
just
my
like a baby
in myself.
I suffered like hell.
My mother had to stay with me all the time. She couldn't leave me 1 hour.
5 decades later, the Government of Canada has been more deeply involved in all this than it wants to admit, with new secret settlements, shutting down lawsuits, and gag orders. And as you'll see after the break, it is not something they want you to know about.
The government doesn't seem to do anything. They don't recognize you. It's wrong. It's shameful.
The story doesn't end here. Like the Fifth Estate's Facebook page so you can follow our investigations. We will post updates on stories and special video features that take you deep inside.
From 1950 until the mid-60s, Montreal's respected psychiatric facility, the Allen Memorial Institute, was the site of secret brainwashing experiments, funded by the CIA under the codename MKUltra, with money from the Canadian government as well. The program would quietly be shut down in 1965. But the truth about what happened there would be protected for another decade and a half longer. Then, in 1980, we were among the first to tell Canadians about it.
The Fifth Estate.
I'm Adrienne Clarkson. Tonight we report on a secret CIA research project carried out in Montreal in which mental patients felt they were used as the CIA's guinea pigs.
They kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks.
And the Fifth Estate stayed on the story for years to come. From then to now, many of the key questions have remained the same.
The Fifth Estate.
So why was Ottawa so ambiguous when it came to helping some Canadian citizens get compensation from Washington for what they endured in a program that was inspired mostly by American Cold War fears? Well, the answer was simple. The government of Canada was even more deeply involved in the Allen Memorial experiments than the Americans.
Get away!
Hold him!
After word of the experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute came out, the CBC broadcast a drama entitled The Sleep Room about Dr. Ewan Cameron's mind control treatments. In the absence of visual evidence inside the hospital, it is as close as we can come to how it looked and sounded.
Natalie?
Driving doesn't work. Can you admit that now? You destroyed these people for nothing! You can't just walk away from this, Cameron! It'll come back and it'll ruin you!
Many of them were just sitting there like zombies, and I have a headache. I don't remember anything.
Gina Blasbalg was 15 and in an orphanage when she was sent to the Allen. She got massive drug doses and was kept asleep for months. Fortunately, she never received electroshock therapy, which may explain why she remembers the real Dr. Cameron and his patients.
How did those patients regard, or apparently regard, Dr. Cameron?
Those patients were too far gone. The ones that were not too far gone were terrified of him. We were all terrified to see him around. We didn't want to be near him. I don't think that any patient ever wanted to be close to Dr. Cameron.
When news of Cameron's experiments was revealed, 9 of the Canadian victims filed a lawsuit against the Central Intelligence Agency, alleging they had been unwittingly used in research that was medically improper, even illegal. Plaintiff Velma Orlico of Winnipeg didn't think they stood a chance.
I've often, when I've been alone at home, thought, how can you fight the CIA? Who in heck do you think you are? How can you fight the CIA?
But eventually, in the late 80s, David got a concession from Goliath. The CIA settled with the Canadian patients for about $90,000 apiece. A moral victory, at least. And a few years after that, in the 90s, the Government of Canada announced its own compensation plan. But only for the most seriously injured victims, those who survived the experiments in a childlike state. The government also insisted it had no legal or moral obligation to do it.
To many, that system seemed designed not to distribute compensation, but to discourage it. In the end, only 80 of the patients subjected to the brutal psychiatric experiments were approved for federal compensation. Another 250 were denied. And who knows how many more never even knew the compensation program existed. So when the application deadline came and went, and it was too late to apply, the government's secret brainwashing program simply faded into the past. Or did it?
The government deadline expired 23 years ago, and the majority of survivors had already passed away. When a few weeks back, CBC News reporter Elizabeth Thompson was poring over government financial records. Buried deep within those 2017 public accounts was an item about a mysterious payment linked to those brainwashing experiments years ago.
It talked about, compensation for someone who had been depatterned at the Allen Memorial Institute.
Name withheld, it said. No other information about the victim was available. But with some digging, Elizabeth Thompson would learn the Trudeau government had prevented the victim's family from ever discussing the settlement. Thompson discovered the name withheld was that of Allison Steele. She's the daughter of Gene Steele, who arrived at the Allen Institute in 1957 with a severe case of postpartum depression. Today, Allison Steele still can't discuss the settlement, but she can talk about her mother. She says she effectively was raised without a mom after Gene became a Cameron patient and the years of drugs, sleep therapy, and electroshock.
It's erasing your memory. I mean, how dare they do that to a human being? How dare they do that to a human being?
According to Allison, the result was that when Jean eventually returned home, behind her lovely smile, she was intellectually and emotionally absent, her marriage and family relationships irretrievably broken. Allison's family had been trying to get compensation and failing for decades. In 1993, Allison's father's application was officially denied in writing after the government wouldn't give him the hospital records he needed to prove his wife had been medically tortured.
I have a big thick file of all his handwritten letters back and forth to the government, stating all of the treatments that, all of the things that had happened to her, but we didn't have the main file.
And then the years went by. First, Allison's mother, Jean, died. And her father passed away at 93, his quest to have the federal government do what's right for victims like Jean still unfulfilled. But 2 years ago, a breakthrough. Allison made an official request for her mother's full medical file under the Access to Information Act. And this time, incredibly, a package arrived in the mail.
So I waited, and sure enough, about a month later, I received a manila envelope with about 300 pages, legal size, double-sided, of all of the bedside notes.
In the basement chest in Knowlton, Quebec, where she stores those records, is a mine of information that the government had kept to itself for decades. Notes her father could have used years ago to prove what happened to her mother. Among those newly discovered notes, some written by Ewan Cameron himself. Allison's mother, Jean, is described as overactive, overtalkative, distractible, very suspicious, showing inappropriate behavior, and crying for no reason. Those adjectives certainly could describe someone no longer mature enough to be a mother because of Dr. Cameron's depatterning. And other notes from Cameron and colleagues clearly state that Jean Steele had at least 24 intensive electroshock sessions and might require weekly shock treatments for the next 2 to 5 years, seemingly indicating a very serious condition.
Now, these are the files your dad never saw.
He never saw those files.
Your father never got that kind of material.
No, he didn't. Well, I guess it was his word against the government's word.
How do you think he would feel about you and this?
Oh, he would be proud as punch. He would be proud as punch of me. I know he would. Oh, yeah. He would be very happy.
When Allison Steele took those new medical documents to her lawyer, Alan Stein, he immediately launched a court action against the federal government. He says the Steele family finally had the proof they'd always needed.
There's no question about it. The her medical history and medical report confirms this.
You talk to Allison, she says, that took my mother away. She had no capacity to be a mature parent after that.
That's right. And I've seen that. I've seen medical reports from many, many other former patients of Dr. Cameron who were denied compensation, and the same thing happened to them.
And ultimately, the federal government would agree to pay compensation in her mother's name, on the condition neither she nor her lawyer ever talk about it in public.
What does that tell us about the mindset of the current government? That this should be something they insist upon?
Because they don't want more applications. They don't want to have to deal with more applications. If this went to court, it would have more publicity and more applications would be forthcoming.
Now, in accepting your settlement, you were required to have a non-disclosure agreement.
Correct.
You couldn't talk about the settlement itself.
No.
let me ask you about what that represents. Is that not apparently a way for the government to limit the number of people who learn about this, who might be entitled to something like this themselves?
Well, it seems to be something because...
Why else would they do it?
Why they're still covering it up? Why are they still covering it up? Maybe they won't if they hear about this. You know, maybe they will try to realize and recognize what the government did before, and maybe there's still hope that they could at least recognize these victims.
And lawyer Alan Stein says it's now time for the Government of Canada to finally admit the role it played in those brutal experiments.
The government never admitted, acknowledged that it was responsible for the experiments carried out by Dr. Cameron, and which experiments the Government of Canada funded. There was no question that the Government of Canada funded these experiments.
Do you believe that responsibility should be taken?
I definitely believe it.
The years of silence haven't been easy for the victims. For survivor Ellen McIntosh and her oldest daughter Diane, it's taken years to be able to discuss it all with one another. Diane was only 3 when her mother entered the Allen Institute, and Ellen knows too well that Diane and the other girls have been profoundly affected by what happened to her.
I just hope that she, I know she's forgiven me for, I don't think she's ever held it against me. When she was on the phone, all she said was, "I love you so much, I love you so much." And I know she does, you know.
I'm still dealing with this and still struggling with it. There have been negative ramifications in my life and that have prevented me from being happy and from being productive at many times.
Ellen McIntosh was one of the lucky ones. Got a hard-fought settlement from the government in the 1990s, but she says for her it was about a lot more than that.
I got the compensation, but for me it wasn't the money, it was the validation that I received, that I wasn't totally crazy, you know, that I was treated the way I was, and it made me do crazy things, but I didn't go in there crazy.
Not having our mom was not great, but if you remind her of that, it hurts her too much, you know. And I just have to say, it wasn't you, it was them.
It is now the better part of 7 decades since the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal became that house of horrors. Today, perhaps hundreds of Canadians, survivors and family members, are still paying the price for the brainwashing experiments sponsored by the Canadian and American governments. Yet to this day, neither the U.S. nor Canada has ever said we're sorry.
The object of this presentation is to demonstrate the effect of MER-17, a new blocking agent against the development of LSD-25 psychosis. We have used 2 healthy graduate students in psychology as subjects, but time permits us to show only one. On the first experimental day, Ronnie, aged 22 and weighing 75 kilograms, was given 100 gamma of LSD-25 in distilled water orally. This is a very small quantity of LSD-25, but all investigators report that it is enough to produce a temporary psychotic dissociation state in any healthy adult. The scene which follows shows what happened to Ronnie after he drank the LSD-25 solution. And if you will follow the clock, you will be able to note time intervals accurately. Now, how do you feel after an hour?
Like I should be getting sick. But it's different in that I'm not. I mean, I'd be sick by this time if I were going to.
Feel almost a nausea?
Almost is a good word. Yeah.
Anything else?
Dryness of throat, but it feels as though if I did take a drink or something, well, I wouldn't keep it. So and there is I have to maintain my attention. It's an effort to talk to you right now, for instance. Reality's leaving.
Bill, you were talking to Ronnie. Ron, a while ago we separated you and Dick. Do you have any idea why we did that?
No, it's yes, I do. You just separated us to see how we would react.
You felt, though, that we were separating you to see how you alone reacted. And you felt that we were watching you. Is that right or wrong?
No, you haven't been watching me one way or the other.
You don't think we're trying to pull anything on you?
No.
Bill, why did you assume that particular line of inquiry with Ronnie about the separation of the two boys? Because I felt at the time of separation that Ronnie did have some very real paranoid feelings and felt as though we separated the two of them so we could spy on Ronnie alone. And yet when he sat down before the camera, he didn't voice any of those paranoid ideas. No, I think it's interesting that he was able to mobilize his defenses and to deny that he did have those feelings at the time. I feel that they were really there, and I think he did show other evidences of paranoid feelings. Ronnie, you look tired, are you?
Yeah.
Have you got anything particular to report to me?
No.
Do you feel slowed up?
Decidedly.
How is your mood? Are you unhappy?
No.
You feel gay?
No emotion.
No emotion at all. Does it seem like you've been here a great long time?
I've lost all time perception. It's probably sometime in the afternoon is all I can tell you. So.
Have you had any visual phenomena or any auditory phenomena?
I was in on the couch. I was nothing that can describe, but there were a lot of colors and things taking shapes.
Were they geometric patterns, or were they just sort of like a batik? Were they just sort of run together, or what?
I'm sorry, what were you?
You forgot what I asked you.
The auditory visual things. Yeah, they're geometric in shape, I'd say.
Anything you'd like to do right now?
No.
If you had Aladdin's lamp and could do anything in the world you want to do right now, what would you like to do?
Get rid of this nervousness. Apprehensive.
Do you feel as though you're in contact with this situation and with us and with people around us?
I really don't know.
Ronnie, have you been sleeping for the last few minutes?
Not exactly. No.
You've been lying down on the bed.
No.
Are you thinking about anything in particular? What did I ask you, Ronnie?
You asked me if I were thinking about anything.
Are you worried?
No, I don't think so.
You've been lying down, you haven't been talking. If I asked you how you felt, could you describe the way you feel? What did I ask you, Ronnie? Ron?
Yeah.
What did I ask you?
Oh. How I felt or something, I guess.
Could you answer it?
I feel all right.
Ron? It's been 6 hours since you took that drink. Are you still feeling badly?
Yeah.
Do you know where you are?
Yeah.
Where are you?
Christ Hospital.
Has your mind been on anything in particular? Have you been thinking about anything in particular?
No.
Do you feel depressed?
No.
Do you feel elated?
No.
Have you been seeing anything by way of colors, or have you been hearing anything unusual?
No.
If I were to ask you how you felt, could you tell me?
I guess I am sad. I'm depressed. That's about all.
What sort of mental activity are you going through?
Confusion.
Well, Ron, you said that you thought the sun was in the wrong position when you looked out the window.
Yeah, I lost time perception.
Do you think that you're clearing at all, or are you still quite muddled?
I don't think in the last 15 minutes anything has been any improvement now.
Are you anxious? Are you fearful? Are you worried?
I'm awfully nervous.
Mm-hmm. What would you classify your mood as?
My mood, apprehensive.
You know about what?
No.
What has your mental content been lately? Do you know what you've been thinking about?
Just trying to keep things or true situations, trying to be aware of it, trying to stay in contact with reality.
Have you felt a waxing and waning with reality?
Well, sometimes I've been confused about which is reality and which isn't. I mean, what little situations I was aware of noises, for instance, that may have been to annoy me and may not have been. And rather than investigate, I just sort of let them go.
Can you describe to us how this thing was some hours back when you were in the middle of it?
Just mass confusion is all. That's it, confusion.
Would you say it was pleasant or unpleasant?
I wasn't aware at the time of any pleasantness or unpleasantness, and I'm still not. I'm not aware of any pleasantness or unpleasantness. I'm emotionless about them.
Well, Ronnie, do you think the picture showed the whole story of your LSD 25 experience?
Not by a long shot.
The day after the experiment, you wrote out something about it. Would you mind reading a part of it?
Not at all. I had very little by way of visual hallucinations, but what I consider the important thing that, well, what's the word to describe it? Dissociated, plagued, pounded, weighed. All three are inadequate to describe the horrible state I was in, all of them put together. Perhaps the central thing was suspicion and fear that you would find out about me, or perhaps think things that were not true. My overwhelming concern became, are they doing this to find out how I'll act? Are they deliberately rattling that damn paper to make me angry? On and on and on this went. And, as was no doubt obvious, I decided to do as little as possible so I wouldn't make any mistakes. It was my confusion, the fact that I had to study the situation, to be careful that, shall I say, racked me up.
I believe that there was still a trace of this suspiciousness when we took you home that night. Would you mind telling us about the television experience?
It's hard to believe, but I joined the family to look at television in the living room, and I'll be damned if it wasn't talking in loaded phrases too. That made my reason take another step toward control, and I felt better.
Well, thank you very much, Ronnie. This essentially paranoid type of reaction pattern has been described repeatedly by investigators of LSD-25 psychosis. During the next week, Ronnie was given a 5 milligram tablet of our new blocking agent twice daily, and one final tablet on the morning of the second experimental day. Our clinical experience with Meritran convinced us that this compound was quite different from any other central nervous system stimulants that we had known before. And we were interested in the effect of some of its isomers. When the nitrogen atom is moved from the alpha to the gamma position, an entirely new compound results pharmacologically. And it is this gamma isomer of Meritran which we have used as a blocking agent against LSD-25 psychosis. We were led to its use because of some dramatic, though inconsistent, results we had obtained when we used it on patients with schizophrenia. And now, let us return to Ronnie and the second experimental day. Good morning to you. Good morning. I believe you've been taking one 5 milligram tablet of this compound twice daily throughout the last week. That's right. And you took one this morning. Yes, sir. All right, now here we are with 1/10 of a milligram of LSD in distilled water. So down the hatch. Well, Ronnie, does it seem to be a half an hour since you took the LSD?
Yes, sir.
Have you got anything to report to us in this first half hour?
Nothing, which is something to report.
It's been an hour since you've taken LSD. What can you report to us?
Well, now I can definitely tell that I have taken it. But my thoughts seem to be in good shape so far.
Well, Ronnie, it's been an hour and a half since you took the LSD, and I've noticed an increasing restlessness in you.
Extreme restlessness, yes, sir. But my thoughts are in good control. I mean, I'm much more confident at this time than I was last.
It's been 2 hours now since you've taken the LSD. Does it seem that that's right?
Yeah, that's true.
And there's been no distortion of time sense?
No.
Of the passage of time. Well, let's ask you first how your body feels.
It feels fine. There's no sensations one way or the other.
Well, now, you've been restless. You did a lot of pacing for a while, and then you lay down for a while.
Yeah.
Now, what can we find out about your mental processes? Have you had any feeling of drifting in and out of the world of reality at all?
Well, no, I haven't.
It's now 2.5 hours since you took the LSD. Does that seem right to you?
Yes, it's about right.
And there has been no alteration or distortion of your sense of time?
No, I don't think so.
Has much transpired in the last half hour, as far as you're concerned?
Well, one way or the other, no.
Now, last week you had the very uncomfortable feeling that all of us were indulging in double talk. Is there any of that feeling in you now?
None whatsoever. I think that'd be a sort of a dissociative feeling that I don't have now.
Anything new to report to me at this time?
I don't think there's anything new. It's there's been no real change, I don't think, that I'm aware of.
At 3 hours last week, I asked you that if you had Aladdin's lamp and could get your most desired wish, you said that you would wish that something could be done to get rid of the nervousness that you had. Would you answer in the same way today?
I'm not sure. I think I'd be more aware of the possibilities of such an offer today than I.
Ronnie, what time does it seem to be?
It's somewhere. I'd say about 3:30, 4 o'clock, something like that.
Now, in the last half hour, we've been sort of having a general discussion on philosophic things, the pitfalls and scientific methods and so on. You seem to be sort of interested in what we were.
I followed your conversation.
If you could do exactly what you wanted to do right now, would you be doing anything different than you're doing?
Well, I could be home, if that's what you mean. I could probably be doing something a little more enjoyable, yeah.
What would be enjoyable in your thinking right now?
I don't know, being outside. It seems like a nice day out.
Well, Ronnie, we're now at the 5.5 hour after taking LSD period. You're just telling me outside that this is nothing like it was last week.
It is nothing like it was last week. There are some of the same symptoms, and it seems that it were ready to happen, but it just didn't. It doesn't. I mean, when I went to lie down last Saturday, I could have easily sort of been swallowed up, and I was trying to do it then, just now, and it just didn't happen. That's all.
You said that last week when you lay down and closed your eyes, something closed over your mind.
That's right.
But you can't find that today. Try as you will. Ronnie, you wrote out your experience after the second episode or two. Would you mind reading us part of it?
No. It was quite similar, yet it was so very, very different. Where the first time my mind began racing and becoming tangled and eventually swallowing me up, despite my efforts. The second time, my efforts to fight it off were successful. In one sentence, I think it might be summed up rather adequately by saying it was a fight both times, but the second time I won.
Well, thank you very much. There are probably many questions that you wish answered about this work.
And Doctor, what dosage of the blocking agent have you found to be effective?
We have ranged from 10 to 15 to 20 to 30, 50, and 100 milligrams. There are individual differences. In the lower ranges, the blocking is not necessarily complete, but in the higher ranges, it is so invariably.
Have you done this on any more subjects, Dr. Clavey?
Yes, 8 so far in a double-blind study, and the blocking effect was consistent.
Is a week of pre-treatment necessary in all cases?
No, sir. We have already discovered that 2 days of pre-treatment suffices, and our guess is that it can be shortened even more.
Did you say that this drug has clinical application?
Well, time will tell, but we've been quite impressed with our clinical results so far in some cases of acute schizophrenia, some cases of alcoholic hallucinosis, some senile hallucinatory states, and even a few cases of chronic schizophrenia. They represent about 60 cases in all. And furthermore, we are continuing our experimental work with hallucinogenic drugs such as mescaline, cannabis, adrenochrome, etc. Are there any other questions?
Yes. Can MER-17 be used intravenously?
Yes, and it's very interesting, too. On December the 18th, 1954, Ronnie drank a second 100 gamma of LSD-25 without protection. 4.5 hours later, he was in an almost catatonic state. At that time, 10 milligrams of MER-17 was given intravenously and repeated in 15 minutes. This brought about a complete cessation and dissolution of his LSD-25 psychosis. Look at the picture.
I'm right here.
Do you feel that you're very close to us in your thinking?
No. No.
Can you tell me anything about what you have been thinking about? Is it too painful to talk about? Ron, how long does it seem to have been since you took the LSD?
Anyway, a couple hours, I guess.
Are you upset?
No.
Are you muddled?
Yeah.
Can you tell me anything about your thinking now? Ron? Can you tell me anything about your thinking now?
I can't understand.
How do you feel?
All right.
Does anything make much sense to you now?
No.
What seems to be the matter?
Nothing.
Can you think?
No.
Can you tell me what's going on inside of your head? Ronnie, are you frightened? Are you fearful?
No.
Now, Ron, we're going to give you an injection to see whether it makes you feel any better. I don't suppose you taste anything, do you? You feel anything? All right. Now, about 3 minutes since you took the injection. What can you say about things now?
I don't know.
Do things seem any clearer to you?
They do. I don't know why.
Can you elaborate on that in any way?
I'm just not as confused.
Now, Ron, it's been about 12 minutes since we gave you your injection. You just said that you feel like you have reality in your grasp and it's waxing and waning.
That's right.
Can you tell me anything more about it?
Maybe I said it's just a reorganization or a getting things in place again.
Is it a pleasant comeback, as it were, or is it disturbing to get things reorganized properly?
No, it's the more I can, the more the better I feel.
Hey, we're giving you a second injection about 17 minutes after the first one. How are you feeling now, Ron?
Like I'm waking up from a fever or something.
Is it a pleasant feeling to be waking up from a fever like this?
Well, it's pleasant to be back, I guess.
Bill, is there any change in his blood pressure?
No, his blood pressure and pulse remain essentially the same.
Why, it's been 30 minutes since we gave you the first injection and 15 minutes since we gave you the second one. Now, let's try to say how you feel now. I know it's hard.
Well, I haven't yet a foundation from which I can speak.
Do you think you feel differently than you did 30 minutes ago when we walked into this room?
Yes, I guess I do, very much so.
Now, Ronnie, it's been an hour since we gave you your first intravenous injection. I believe things have sort of come back into their proper perspective for you, haven't they?
I think so, yeah.
Now, when you were under the LSD, you wanted to be in that room alone. You were fearful that there might be some sort of an invasion of your privacy, your integrity. Isn't that right? And now that's all cleared up, and you've got things straightened away. Is that right?
I'm no longer anxiety-ridden about it.
Mm-hmm. Are you your normal self now, do you think, Ron?
As nearly as I can tell, I am, yes.
You will probably be interested in my subjective reaction to this last experiment. The first and third experiments were similar, of course. Complete and insoluble confusion and anxiety reigned, and the knowledge that its cause was a drug was my sole and small reassurance. One hallucination was that of lying flat on a slowly revolving cloud-like object. There were other similar objects all around, touching gently and revolving in gear. I just rolled slowly down into the depths of this arrangement. Another one I recall is that of a flower bed type of pattern, or perhaps a purposeless pinball machine, with the lights arranged in rows and columns. The lights, or flowers, were growing, then bursting in irregular fashion, one at the left, then at the center, and so on. Next occurred the phenomenon that has happened both times I lost, and perhaps I've neglected to mention it previously. Things seemed to clear up, and I felt sane, yet I knew I wasn't. I seemed to wake up to a new world, the same situation, same people and environment, and yet everything, that is, my mental state, my life, had been altered. I was a stranger in this world. I could no longer speak to anyone as a person. And that was my state when I was given the shot, bewildered, confused, afraid to say a word till I could be sure of which world I was in. I realized that what happened to me in those few minutes after the injection has a tremendous significance. Because of this realization, I have worked it over often since then. But God help me, I can't tell you a thing. It just happened. There was no crescendo, no fitting together of the pieces, no breaking through the surface. All of a sudden, I found myself willing to cooperate, able to follow conversation more easily, just less anxiety-ridden. I don't know how or why. I'm sorry, but that's all I can report.
The Fifth Estate.
Good evening. I'm Eric Malling. 9 Canadians who were the unwitting victims of CIA brainwashing experiments are suing the United States government. But so far, the Canadian government has done nothing to help them.
If I were in charge of a government to whom 9 citizens that we are suing for have been brainwashed without their knowing, have had their lives impaired, and have it done by a foreign agency, undercover without the government of Canada knowing it, I would find a way to help those people instead of hindering them.
4 years ago, there were some startling revelations about the activities of the CIA in Canada. The American Intelligence Agency had paid for a series of brainwashing experiments under a project codenamed MK Ultra. The tests were conducted in secret in the United States and in Canada at a mental hospital attached to McGill University. Experimental drugs, including LSD, were administered to human guinea pigs. The patients were never told that their treatment was part of a CIA experiment. 9 Canadians are now suing the U.S. government for $1 million apiece. They charge that their lives were disrupted forever as a result of the brainwashing. Despite the fact that the CIA operated secretly in Canada to fund these medical experiments on Canadian citizens, the federal government in Ottawa has joined hands with the government in Washington to hold back vital information which might at last reveal all the sordid details.
In Winnipeg, Val Orlico spends a lot of time tending her plants. It's one of the few hobbies she has left. She used to devour books and write long letters. Now she can't concentrate on a book for more than a single page, and writing a letter is beyond her. She's on medication 24 hours a day. If she wasn't married to David Orlico, an NDP member of Parliament, she might never have learned the full story of what happened to her.
That's very good. I better get out the tomatoes and the green pepper and...
In 1956, suffering from depression after childbirth, Mrs. Orlico was referred by her Winnipeg doctor to a top psychiatrist in Montreal. Unknowingly, she was about to become part of a cruel CIA experiment, codenamed MK Ultra. In Langley, Virginia, outside of Washington, stands the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, protected by walls of secrecy as high as the trees. Stored inside computers like this one is what's left of the CIA files on the MK Ultra project. Convinced the Soviets and Chinese had perfected brainwashing during the Korean War, the agency sought to perfect its own techniques, both to protect its agents and to use as a weapon.
Who did you meet with in the safe house?
The CIA man overseeing the project was John Gittinger.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
In Montreal, on the side of the mountain overlooking the city, stands an ancestral home bearing a name worthy of an Edgar Allan Poe horror tale, Ravens Crag. Donated to McGill, Ravens Crag became the Allen Memorial Institute for the Treatment of Mental Illness. Here the CIA channeled money for MK Ultra, Subproject 68, which became a real-life horror tale. The project chief in Montreal was Dr. Ewan Cameron, world-renowned chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at McGill and director of the Allen Memorial Institute.
The CIA secretly funded the medical experiments through a front in New York City called, of all things, the Society for the Protection of Human Ecology. Documents show that the agency had been impressed with earlier work done at McGill in sensory deprivation, work that was useful in designing sophisticated torture techniques later on. But at the time, brainwashing looked even more promising, and Dr. Cameron was the perfect one to carry out the work, an American citizen with a world-class reputation operating outside of the United States.
Dr. Cameron certainly had the credentials. At various times, president of the Canadian, the American, and even the World Psychiatric Association.
These are the days and hours are the occasions.
In an address to colleagues from around the world, Cameron showed that he certainly knew the potential of the human mind, for good and bad.
And it is his mind, no less, which may destroy mankind.
Val Orlico came to the Allen for her postpartum depression.
Everybody in the hospital was very much in awe of Dr. Cameron, and he strode the halls like a giant. And people would say, oh, there but for God goes God. And to me, I thought, how could he possibly ever take me for a patient? Who am I? I mean, this great man who's done all these marvelous things. And boy, I better work hard, and I better do everything that he tells me to do. And, you know, I don't want to lose this opportunity to get well.
Like Mrs. Orlico, Mrs. Janine Huard of Montreal came to Dr. Cameron depressed after childbirth. The depression was made worse by a hearing problem that coincided with the birth of her child. She, too, was in awe of Dr. Cameron.
He was a very, very impressive man. And I was told he was the best doctor in North America. So he would look at you a few minutes, ask you a few questions, and then proceed with the treatments.
But I never saw him once in all the times that I saw him that I wasn't afraid. Every time I went down to his office, I would shake with fear. And every time I'd see him coming down the hall, I'd shake with fear. But I adored him.
Dr. Elliot Emanuel knew Cameron.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
At Ravenscraig, Dr. Cameron went further with drugs and electric shock treatments than any of the U.S. researchers in the MK Ultra project dared. His aim was to wipe the mind clean. Then he would implant new messages by forcing the patient to listen to a hypnotic repetition as many as 250,000 times. This was called psychic driving. Most of the drugs used in the program were experimental, and some dangerous. There was the tranquilizer Artane, a paralysis-inducing anectine, and curare, which pygmies tipped their arrows with to paralyze victims. Bulbocapnan, another experimental tranquilizer, and lysergic acid diethylmide, the hallucinogen LSD. In her room at Ravenscraig, Mrs. Orlico waited for her first treatment.
Well, I saw a tray with hypodermic, with a needle, a syringe, and the card on it had my name, so I looked a little more closely, and it was lysergic acid diethylamide. And my husband was a druggist, and I knew a lot of drugs, but I'd never heard of that one. And so I phoned a friend, and who was a psychiatric nurse, and I said, do you know what it is? And she said, I never heard of it. But she had a friend who was a psychiatrist, so she phoned her friend, and she called me back, and she said, he said that this stuff causes poisonous psychosis. She said he said not to take it. Well, I thought, you know, he's a very Freudian psychiatrist and doesn't believe in any medication of any kind. And after all, here's Dr. Cameron. I mean, he's the big doctor, and he's, you know, he's known all over the world, and he wouldn't do anything that would harm me, etc. And so I took the injection, and I didn't like it. And it really did create a poisonous psychosis.
LSD, with all its frightening mental images, was scarcely known at the time. But the CIA secretly brought some in from Switzerland, where it had just been developed.
The room became very distorted, and I thought my bones were all melting. And I just wanted to scream that I wanted to get out of there. And I saw the squirrels outside, and I thought, they're not the squirrels, I'm the squirrel. I'm in this cage, and I can't get out. And I started to throw myself from side to side in the room. And I couldn't write. They had given me a pencil and paper and asked me to write down, but I couldn't write. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't focus. I don't know. It was like some kind of funny hell I'd fallen into, and I couldn't get out. And I don't know how long that went on. It was just a terrible nightmare. And I just felt that my life was threatened. I could never go back to what I'd been.
Robert Logie of Vancouver was 18 when he came to the Allen complaining of trembling, and severe leg pains, diagnosed as psychosomatic. Like Mrs. Orlico and Mrs. Huard, he had no inkling he was to be part of a CIA experiment.
The LSD was very horrifying, and they gave it to me for about 12 or 15 times. One minute I would see the doctor there, the next minute I wouldn't see him there, and they were asking me all kinds of questions, and I remember them telling me that I was getting smaller and smaller, and I really felt myself getting smaller. And they were bringing me back in time, way back, you know. At one point, I almost felt like I was just about to be born, really, that far back in memory. And they were really probing, asking all kinds of questions, and I felt I didn't have any control. I had to answer. I didn't feel I had any control. I was completely, like they had complete control over me.
Mrs. Huard, like the others, was forced to pay for the so-called treatment, massive electric shocks, and all the drugs.
They would give me as much as 40 pills a day, and I would ask the nurse, what is that? They would say it's a new drug, and they only name it by a number.
What did all those drugs do to you? How did they make you
Well,
feel?
I was very, very strong, well-powered. So these drugs kind of desensitize me. They would lower my reactions. They would lower my resistance.
As well as the experimental drugs and massive electric shock treatments, Mrs. Huard was subjected to psychic driving. Hypnotic-like messages were repeated over and over to a sleeping patient, sometimes for as long as 16 hours in a row. They were a key part of the mind control experiment. This is how Mrs. Huard remembers one of the messages.
Why are you running away from your responsibilities, Janine? Why, Janine? Why? Janine, why are you running away from your responsibilities? Why are you running away from your responsibilities, Janine? Why are you running away from your responsibilities? Why are you running away from your responsibilities? Why are you running away?
I would try very strongly not to let my mind be capturing all the messages, but they would lower my resistance so much with the heavy drugs, but I couldn't do otherwise than listen.
Did you ever ask them how any of this was making you better?
No, I didn't ask questions. I would just say, I don't want to go through it again. And I would cry. I didn't want it, you know. I knew it. Way down in my heart, I knew it wasn't good. But, you know, how could you fight? You're in a hospital where it's supposed to be the best, with the best doctors. So, what can you do?
I'd say, I can't take it anymore. I can't stand it. I don't think this is doing me any good. I feel worse. And he'd walk down the hall a little way with me and put his arm on my shoulder. And come on now, lassie, you know you're going to do it. And finally I'd say, well, okay. And off we'd go to my room, and he would give me another injection and then pat me on the shoulder, and off he'd be again. I had LSD, I believe, a total of 14 times. And sometimes there would be 4 days between the injections, and sometimes there would be one consecutive day after the other. And some of them I managed to write down things in my notes to Dr. Cameron.
A newly declassified CIA document shows there was at least one voice of protest at the agency as the experiments got underway. One agent wrote, "Does Project Officer approve these immoral and inhuman tests? I suggest that all who are in favor of the above intended operation volunteer their heads for use in Dr. So-and-so's noble project." The names were deleted. In her hospital room, a terrified Mrs. Orlico tried to hide like a child at the sound of Dr. Cameron's approaching footsteps.
I heard him coming, and I hid in the washroom in my room.
And I thought, well, I'll go and sit on the toilet. Nobody will see me. Anyhow, that didn't work because he knocked on the door and he said, now, come on, Lassie, you know you're in there, and come on, you come out and let me give you your injection. And I said, no, I'm not taking any more injections. I can't do it. I don't care if I die. I can't do it anymore because this is killing me, and that's all there is to it. I can't do it. Well, he wasn't very happy about it. And however, after a little discussion, he turned on his heel and left the room.
The electric shock treatments were administered on an unprecedented scale. It was called de-patterning. The mind was short-circuited so the psychic driving hypnotic messages could be planted on a clean slate. There is now no known use of electric shocks on such a scale, even in Soviet mental asylums where political crimes are punished. Psychiatrist and former colleague of Dr. Cameron, Dr. Elliot Emanuel.
As you probably know, electroshock treatment has been given for depression for something like 40 years now. It's a very successful and useful treatment for severe depression that doesn't respond to other things. But de-patterning is a use of electroshock treatment in a totally different way, in which instead of giving the shocks, say, 2 or 3 times a week, they're given 2 or 3 times a day for 3 or 4 weeks, reducing the patient to a sort of animal, vegetable state, from which it's hoped that they would recover in a more healthy state of mind. It didn't work.
I was there for a while, and I thought, I don't want to stay here, and I started to run away from the hospital, and they grabbed me, and then they put me on sleep treatment. And they kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks and playing tapes.
There was another lady who had the same kind of psychic driving that I did, and she was a very wiry, slender lady, and with lots of pep and zip, you know, and she'd go to the dances and this and that. And one day she just wasn't there. And when we asked where she went, they said, oh, well, you know, she's gone to another hospital. Well, sometime later, I was in the day hospital, and I happened to ask a nurse if she'd heard what had happened to this lady. And she said, oh, that's her sitting over there. And I looked, and there was a fat lady that just looked like she was made out of dough. She didn't know me. She didn't know herself. She didn't know anybody. She was gone. Now that's a death.
Did you ever try and get away from there? Did you ever say, I'm just not going back?
I tried. I was home for the weekend. And I had a pass for the weekend. That's how they call it. So when I was there, I said, I'm not going back there. So I telephoned, or somebody else in the house telephoned, and they said, if you're not coming back, we're sending the police after you. So I remember being so upset. I was crying. I didn't want to go in. And it was really like a concentration camp.
There was a gentleman who jumped off the roof of the Allen. I don't think he had LSD, but he had sleep therapy with psychic driving, you know, with the driving tapes under his pillow. And they told him he was going to go home. And he'd just come out of sleep therapy. And he just jumped, he said, went around, big smile on his face, said goodbye to everybody, went up on the roof and jumped off and landed at the back door of the Allen, which was a dreadful, awful thing. I don't think he was more than 30. And he was just gone. Just gone. And there was this big washed area at the back door. Nobody would go in and out of that back door for a long time. And everybody in the hospital spoke in hushed tones, and everybody was affected. They would not talk about it. It was as though it did not happen.
In 1973, all MK Ultra files under the control of the Technical Services Division Chief of the CIA were ordered destroyed by the director, Richard Helms. But in a bureaucracy as vast as the Central Intelligence Agency, it's difficult to destroy everything. And the damning evidence of the Cameron Project surfaced after a Freedom of Information Act suit. It revealed Mrs. Orlico had reason for her nightmares and her doubts.
I've heard that it was the most brutal program under MK Ultra in the States and in Canada, that this was the most brutal. It was an awful feeling to realize when I found this out that the man whom I had thought cared about what happened to me didn't give a damn. I was a fly, just a fly.
Her husband, David Orlico, NDP Member of Parliament for 22 years, remembers the cost.
We had Blue Cross coverage, but we didn't have, but Blue Cross did not cover treatment in a mental hospital. So what we did after the first year was to sell the house, which was really the only money that we had. And my daughter and I moved in with Al's mother. And we stayed there almost 3 years. It was tough, but the financial cost was really a small part of the cost. If you're talking about cost, it really disrupted our lives.
Mrs. Orlico sued the Allen Memorial Institute, and last year it quietly settled out of court for $50,000. But that's only the amount she estimates she had to pay for what she thought was treatment. Apart from giving Mrs. Orlico her money back, the Allen has done nothing to compensate Cameron's other victims. But in the U.S., a former CIA director, Stansfield Turner, promised the Congress the agency would try and track down victims of the MK Ultra project in both Canada and the U.S. so they might get compensation. The CIA wrote the Allen this recently declassified letter. Addressed to Maurice Danger, then director, it said, "It has been our understanding that there are no remaining records of Dr. Cameron's research that might reveal the identities of patients under his care during the time period in question. However, by way of leaving no stone unturned, we now inquire whether this information might be reconstituted through patient records, financial records, or other hospital records. Sincerely yours, Daniel B. Silver, General Counsel, CIA." So even the CIA made some effort to find the victims, but little help from Montreal.
There is no record of the Allen ever attempting a search of all its medical records, although Cameron's successor admits it would be easy enough to do. CIA documents show that 53 people in Montreal were subjected to the MK Ultra experiments, but only 9 of those have been positively identified. Apart from Orlico, Huard, and Logie, there were 3 Montreal housewives, one of whom is now institutionalized. There's a Montreal businessman who never really got his life together again after the experiments, and another man who's been destitute for most of the time since. Ironically enough, one of the victims is now a psychiatrist practicing in Eastern Ontario. She obviously functions well enough, but after the experiments, 10 years of her memory was wiped right out.
The McGill project was abruptly terminated in 1964, and so Dr. Cameron returned to the United States. 3 years later, he died suddenly of a heart attack. Subsequent evaluation of Cameron's work in Montreal by his successor showed that the intensive shock therapy was not only medically useless, but potentially dangerous. Cameron, though, never revealed how much he knew about the CIA sponsorship of his work. Robert Logie was later given cortisone treatment for the pains in his leg that brought him to the Allen in the first place. It worked, but his mind is a different story. He now has joined with Mrs. Orlico, Madame Huard, and 6 other Canadians in a massive lawsuit against the United States government. They contend that they sought treatment and instead were made unwitting victims of CIA experiments. The 9 Canadians are seeking $1 million apiece in damages from the U.S. government. The CIA intimidates many American law firms, but this case is being fought by a lawyer who defended Lillian Hellman and Arthur Miller during the McCarthy witch hunts for communists. In preparation, the lawyers have interrogated every CIA agent involved in MK-Ultra, including former director Helms. With the trial expected to start soon, Joseph Raw sums up the case with his junior partner, James Turner.
What we get out of Gittinger?
John Gittinger is the former CIA staff agent who testified that at his request, the CIA contacted Cameron and informed him that a front in New York would support his work. As a result of that, Cameron received CIA funds to finance the LSD and brainwashing experiment.
In other words, Cameron, all he did was what the CIA was in effect asking him to do.
Yeah.
And what he said he was going to do, and he did it. And
then they paid him money for it.
And then what about Gottlieb now? We got a lot of stuff out of Gottlieb. Here's one of his depositions. We got him, I take it. He said, I'm going to wash my hands of this. I'm approve the project, but I don't have to take care of the Canadian citizens who are going to be affected. Is that fair?
That's fair. He admitted that they took no steps whatsoever to guarantee that people wouldn't be injured if it could be avoided, or to make sure that people even knew that they were participating in an experiment.
Well, this guy Gottlieb's got quite a record, doesn't he, on negligent action ahead of time. I mean, before this ever...
He was personally involved in an experiment that resulted in the death of a U.S. Army...
Is that the one where they put the LSD in the Cointreau of a guy named Olson?
Yeah, and then he jumped out of a window and committed suicide in New York City. They managed to cover that up, too.
I like a man who was general counsel of the CIA. His name's Larry Houston. And at that time, he said this was culpable negligence. He was a general counsel. And they went on, left a guy on the job who had been guilty, according to their own lawyer, of culpable negligence. What about Helms? We took his deposition, too. It's right here.
Yeah, it's an awful thick deposition. He didn't remember a whole lot. There's a major case of forget-me's. The only thing that we really got out of him was that he instructed Gottlieb, the CIA's Dr. Gottlieb, to destroy the records.
When the story broke about the covert CIA activities on Canadian soil, the United States sent a formal apology to the Trudeau government. But External Affairs Minister Alan McEachin has refused to release that document to Mrs. Orlico and the others in the lawsuit. This declassified State Department letter shows why. Addressed to the Canadian Embassy, it reads, "This is with reference to your request for the views of the U.S. intelligence community concerning possible release by the Canadian government of certain documents relating to the Orlico matter. Your request was given careful review, on the basis of which it has been requested that the Canadian government withhold from public disclosure the documents in question."
We moved heaven and earth to get the correspondence and the documents and the discussions between the Canadian government and the United States. The United States won't give it to us because they're covering up their wrong. The Canadian government won't give it to us because they're scared of the United States government. Both of them are holding back all of the information about this. I think the case could be broken if the Canadian government would say to the CIA, we're not going to cover up for you any longer. We're going to allow this, we're going to give this material to Mr. Orlico for his case.
Well, if the Canadian government has this apology from the U.S., why in the world do you think they wouldn't release it?
Oh, I just think the Canadian government's a little bit like international wimps in the case of the United States. I don't know why they're so scared of us. We're not going to do anything. I don't think the 7th Army is going to attack Montreal because you give us that material.
I understand, though, that the American position is that this kind of CIA material can't be released for national security reasons. Maybe that's true.
Well, security, my neck. First, the CIA, everything they forget. Then when they have to stop forgetting, because it's ludicrous, then they say it's all national security. What is national security about the apologies of the United States to Canada? They get very belligerent, the Canadians, with the Russians when they shoot down the 007 with some Canadian citizens. But when the CIA covertly does something to all the citizens, ruined the lives of many of these citizens, well, the Canadian government is doing nothing. I don't know why.
Canada made forceful representations on behalf of the Toronto businessman who was kidnapped by bounty hunters taken back to Florida. That wouldn't indicate that they're afraid to make a ruckus down here.
That was a pretty easy situation. I mean, my God, you kidnap a Canadian, take him to the United States, heavens above. And furthermore, who do you have to fight there? A couple of bounty hunters. Here you're fighting the CIA. That scares Canada.
I'm surprised that if your case is as strong as you say, that the American government isn't trying to get an out-of-court settlement, pay out a bunch of money, and just hope it'll go away.
When the CIA went into this brainwashing stuff, what they call the MK Ultra program, when they went into that, they injured lots more people than the 9 we are suing for. They injured a great many other people.
Here in the United States?
Here in the United States. They may feel that they've got so many skeletons in their closet that settling with us, even though we're clearly right and they would like it to go away, would hurt them as a precedent. I can't think of any other reason that they're being so really rough on us.
I think there is a duty on the government to release, in a matter such as this, all of the information it has.
Alan Lawrence is the conservative justice critic in the Commons.
There's been government complicity or government negligence, so be it, you know. It's far better to make a full disclosure and a full confession of your sins in a matter such as this. It's always a difficult thing for anybody to sue a government or sue an agency of a government. And if you don't have the cooperation of your own government in doing it, you have a few strikes against you right off the bat. If the process was reversed, if it was some sort of a secretive Canadian operation taking place in the United States, I'm sure all hell would break loose down there as far as beating of breasts and waving of flags and whatnot.
If the material came from the States, perhaps they're bound by, if not law, good manners to not turn it over if the source of the information doesn't want it turned over.
I don't know about manners. I don't know about international manners very much. But I know this. If I were in charge of a government to whom 9 citizens that we are suing for have been brainwashed without their knowing, have had their lives impaired, and have it done by a foreign agency, undercover without the government of Canada knowing it, I would find a way to help those people instead of hindering them.
We tried to ask External Affairs Minister McEachin why the government of Canada is not helping these Canadian citizens who are victimized by agents of another country. But for more than 2 months, Mr. McEachin has been unavailable to discuss the matter.
What do you want to tell Mr. McEachin, for example, about what happened to you? How you feel about it now?
I would tell him to try what we've been through and see what he would have to say after. Because only when you go through such an experience, one can say how bad it can be and how painful.
I'd say, come on, get off your horse and help us. We need some help from our government. We are innocent victims of something that happened that should never have been. And you can't make it. You can't put us back where we were. But at least do something to help us now. Do something to stand up and say this can't happen in Canada.
What can you possibly get for your clients out of this case?
You can't get their health back. That's not possible. And they're older people, and some of them may die during this stonewalling by the CIA. And some of them may get worse. One of them, at least, is in an institution now. I mean, the thing is very much needing of speed by the to get recompense. You can get some money. That's all you can get. That's all you can get when a doctor misoperates on you. You don't get your health back. There's no way we can get their health back. But what we can get them is some funds to help ameliorate their old age with the damage that's been done to them by this lousy performance that occurred through the CIA by Dr. Cameron mistreating them and hurting them.
One thing which triggered Mrs. Huard's initial depression was growing deafness in one ear. That was later corrected with minor surgery. But no surgery can undo Dr. Cameron's work at Ravenscraig.
I cannot go to sleep without any medication. I have migraine headaches that last for a week at the time. Doctors cannot find a cause. I have slight amnesia. I have a lot of trouble to concentrate.
I've never been able to sleep without medication since the sleep treatment. I went through years and years and years of severe depressions. I dream about it. All my waking hours I think about it. It's eating me up.
I've been hospitalized. When I first went home to Winnipeg, I attempted to take my own life because I couldn't endure the way I felt. And I have a chronic need. I'm very dependent on other people. And I have a chronic depression, which at times gets worse.
Not being with my family, not being able to follow a career, not being able to study anymore, which I wanted to do very much. I would say it cost me my life.